Hey there, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. We're back with Season 3. It's been a little while. It's been about 5 weeks here. For those of you who listened to the end of Season 2, I had to take a break because, unfortunately for me, I do actually have a job and a business to run. And because that job involves state legislative politics, which tend to get kind of spicy in the beginning of the year when states have their legislative sessions, things got real crazy for me real fast. So was living out of a suitcase and on airplanes for a good number of weeks there. Still managed to get out and do a little bit of fishing. But to be honest with you, it was one of those times where it was a struggle to get out to the water. And when I did get out there, it seemed like I usually picked the worst day. It was either so nice that there were 100 other people crawling around on those tailwaters, or it was so brutal that even though I caught fish and had some fun, it's one of those things that it's not exactly a relaxing vacation from the work duties. But still got out there, not as much as I would like, which is unfortunate. But hey, that's the way it goes sometimes when real life intersects with fishing. And now we are back to talk about what happens when we are through all of the craziness for me and the cold weather for everybody. So it's now March. That's not exactly spring. We're still in winter here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next episode, which will be all about fly fishing in the tweener season, which in this case is March and anything near March. But, we're getting close enough to spring that it is time to start thinking about what spring fly fishing means, especially spring backcountry fly fishing. We've got a whole season stacked up with information about how to navigate spring, the challenges of spring, the fun of spring, and all the stuff that comes along with getting back out to the rivers proper, maybe even some high alpine lakes, depending on how early you're willing to go, and how early you can go, depending on when they ice out, and everything in between. So it's going to be a really fun season, lots of information, lots of interviews, I hope, with folks that will be able to shed light in areas where either I can't or where they would be better suited. And as with the last 2 seasons, the goal is to equip you with the information and the knowledge and the recommendations to be able to go out there and start ripping lips as the weather starts getting warmer and the fish start waking up and the anglers start waking up. So spring is coming, and that's awesome. It's time to be excited about it. We can get ready to leave those cold months behind. But like everything else in fly fishing and really everything else in life, the good stuff comes with some trade-offs, right? There are some challenges involved in spring fishing. And in fact, winter is tough. Keeping your hands and feet warm, trying to stay warm in general, trying to navigate the behavior of fish in super cold water. All of that stuff is tough. It can be technically demanding. It can be physically demanding. But spring, I think, is honestly a little bit more challenging because it's got enough winter left in it that you are still facing a lot of the same challenges that you had during the winter months. But it also has this sort of weird in-between phase where everything just gets super unpredictable and can get very difficult to navigate. And that's before we start talking about things like runoff and ice-off patterns and snow melt and everything that comes along with getting out into the backcountry in the spring. It can be complicated stuff. And if you really want to stay on the water, if you really want to get out there and make the most out of your spring months, then you've got some thinking to do about how to do that. And my job and my hope for Season 3 is to help you do exactly that. Now, for this first episode, I want to provide, sort of like we did in Season 2, just a general overview of the challenges that you're going to face in the springtime, right? We kind of know the good stuff. Water temperatures are going to start coming back up. That's going to lead to more insect activity. That's going to lead to more fish activity. The fish's metabolism start coming up. And pretty soon, before you know it, you're fishing dry flies again. That's a beautiful thing, right? You're back on your favorite creeks. Snow's coming off. Life's good. But there's some tough stuff that you're going to have to deal with too. And I think before we head into the meat of Season 3, I want to talk a little bit about what that tough stuff is and what it looks like. And so you can kind of have in the back of your head as we get rolling, okay, this is the stuff that I ought to be thinking about when it comes to backcountry fly fishing and what I need to be ready for. So let's go ahead and hop in. The first challenge is going to be the weather. And that's always a challenge, right? I mean, I feel like every time I do one of these challenge lists, I always mention the weather, and that's because the weather is always a factor. I mean, if you're outside doing anything, but especially fishing, weather matters, and it matters in a big way. If you get the weather wrong, you could, at a minimum, have a bad day and be cold or wet or hot or not catching any fish. Or at the worst, depending on how far out you are, you could get yourself into a pretty dangerous situation pretty quickly. This is especially true in the early spring, right? So like March, maybe the beginning part of April, depending on how quickly things warm up. You just don't know what's going to happen. You could have 65 or 70 degree day for 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row, and then it's snowing on you and there's a high of 25. Or vice versa. You could have a whole bunch of cold weather that dumps a ton of snow, and then suddenly the sun comes out and starts melting all that snow, and it dumps all of this icy cold water into the river, so that even though you're fishing in warmer weather, the water temperatures are just as low as they were in January or February from all of that fresh snow melt coming in. And that's before we start talking about cold fronts, right? So the worst thing that happens in the spring, and I know there are people out there who swear that this is not a thing. We'll get more into detail with this later in the season. But I really do believe that cold fronts and pressure changes have effects on fish and on fishing. Some scientist out there is going to quibble with me about this, I am sure. Maybe one day we'll have him or her come on and tell me why I'm wrong. But from my personal experience, I know that, if there's a cold front coming in, let's say we've had that warm weather and then we're going to catch a snowstorm. If I can fish the leading edge of that thing, it's probably going to be great. If I can fish right after it, it'll probably be fine. But if I'm on the water when that cold front hits, it is like somebody turned off a light switch and there are just no fish to be caught. Everything shuts down, on top of the fact that the weather gets super unpredictable and difficult to manage. That can be really tough, right? And it can be tough for a lot of reasons. In the spring, you don't know whether you need to dress for winter or for summer. You may be wearing heavy stuff in the morning and then stripping off the lighter stuff by the afternoon. You may have days that don't feel much different than they did in February, and you might have days that feel like they're not much different than what you would have in July. And that means you got to carry stuff with you. You have to have stuff with you, and you kind of have to be prepared for both seasons, both warm weather and cold weather, which itself can present some pretty serious logistical challenges when it comes to what you carry, how you layer, how you prep, and everything else related to that. So first and foremost, in the spring, that weather, that's the big one you got to be thinking about. Now, once we finally do see things start to warm up, right? So let's say we finally get to a place where the sun's out consistently. We've got our average air temperatures that are well above freezing. The snow probably has passed, or at least significant threats of snow have passed. Well, you're going to get a little bit of time to enjoy it, usually kind of in that April timeframe until the beginning of May. And then if you're out west or anywhere with mountains and snowpack, you're going to get runoff, right? So all that water that everybody in the country uses that flows through these massive rivers like the Arkansas and the Colorado and a whole bunch of others that are all over the western U.S., those all come from snow melt that sits up in the mountains. So, it snows all winter. All that snow piles up super deep. People go skiing it. It's a lot of fun. But then it melts. And all that snow melt has to go somewhere. And where it goes is into the rivers. And when runoff starts, they get blown out pretty quickly, right? So you'll go from like 150 CFS in your favorite stream to 800 CFS in a matter of a week or so. And once that happens, things start getting complicated. Number one, things start getting dangerous. Seems like every year I hear a story about a couple of guys who decided to jump into a river that's rolling at like 2,000 CFS when it's supposed to be at 400. And they get swept away and die or disappear. And everybody says, oh man, that's so sad. And it is. However, if you have ever been near a river that is in the middle of runoff and seen what that water looks like, you would assume that you would know better than to get into it. But that's not always the case. Every year people get in there. So just from an access and a safety perspective, runoff can be a massive, massive challenge. But really for your average person who isn't looking to risk their life and hope to find one fish sitting up against the bank holding on for dear life, you're probably going to be real limited in where you can fish during runoff. Your favorite streams will be blown up for at least a month, probably 6 weeks, sometimes 2 months, depending on how much the snowpack is, depending on how warm it gets and how quickly. But it could be quite a long time. And in the meantime, you can be kind of stuck, right? Because runoff's fairly early in the season. A lot of the high alpine lakes have not iced off in May and early June. A lot of them are not open until July, early July at the earliest, but probably more like mid-July. And that means those are closed. And so suddenly you're stuck in this crazy situation where your favorite freestones are blown up and you really can't fish them safely or effectively. The high alpine lakes aren't open yet, and the tailwaters, well, the tailwaters are the tailwaters, right? You're probably sick to death of fishing those things after the winter anyway. Maybe not. I don't mean to project, but I am sick to death of fishing those things after doing it all winter most of the time. They're going to get crowded because they're one of the few places that have controlled flows. And in some cases, if runoff is severe enough, they might be running super high because the dam managers may be spilling water from those dams to mitigate the massive amounts that are being dumped into the systems upstream. So fishing can get kind of complicated, and that means you might have to start getting creative about where you go. So maybe you're jumping on a kayak and going after some different species or trout in lower elevation lakes. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Maybe you're going to go after some early season pike and really get one of those big toothy things on a big, nasty, gaudy streamer that you're throwing around with an 8-weight. Maybe you're going to try to get up into one of the tributaries where maybe the runoff is not quite as severe as it would be somewhere else. But one way or another, you're going to want to be out there fishing. Runoff's going to make it tough. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can mitigate that and still be out there on the water slaying fish during the height of runoff, even if it's not the way you might usually fish. After runoff, it's kind of game on, right? The rivers start calming down and you can get back out there and doing your thing. But now, if you're a high alpine guy, and man, let me tell you guys, I am a high alpine guy. I love fishing moving water. I love fishing, especially small streams. So don't get me wrong. I love that. That's my bread and butter. But man, I live for that short 2-month or so window when you can start hitting those high alpine lakes. And by the end of the spring, so late May, June, maybe mid-June, kind of, I guess, spring into summer there, you're starting to get into a place where you might be able to catch some early ice out at those lower elevation lakes. So these are lakes that are, below 10,000 feet that are starting to ice out early. And man, if you can hit that ice out window and get up there at the right time, those fish are going to be hungry. And you can get up there and have an amazing time just slaying fish doing that stuff. Now, keep in mind at 8,000 or 9,000 feet or 10,000 feet, even in June, you're probably walking through a bunch of snow, and I bet you it still feels like winter. Some days it might even snow on you. But if you're willing to put up with that, you can get up there and you can have a pretty good time doing early season stuff on those high alpine lakes. Once you get a little further in and those lakes ice off completely, well, now it's the world's your oyster, right? You can decide to do moving water. You can decide to go hike into those backcountry creeks. I love to do that. You can go and hike into all of those backcountry lakes. And really your toughest problem becomes, which one do I want to do today? And which ones do I have time to do during the warmer months? And that's one of those things that a lot of people don't think about, but you kind of have this tiered work up into the full range of summer fly fishing opportunities where you can start working your way back up the mountains, right? So remember, as fall moved into winter, we were working our way down from the mountains, working our way down in elevation. Now we're working our way back up the mountains, working our way back up in elevation to those higher lakes at 10,000, 11,000, 12,000, or even higher. And it's kind of this reverse process. And, through all of this, you have a whole bunch of other considerations you have to think about, right? Especially related to what we're all here to talk about, which is the fly fishing part, right? So you've got these wildly fluctuating water temperatures going on in the spring, and that can throw fish for a crazy loop. You can get to a backcountry stream. This happened to me actually last summer, or last spring, I should say, where I hiked into my favorite spot. I was a little early, didn't touch a fish all day. Water was just too cold. It was too unstable. It just didn't work out for me, right? Hiked in there a week later, caught 50 fish in like 5 hours. I mean, it's such a swing in the spring, and it can be so different day to day and week to week that it is a challenge just to keep up with it, to be honest with you. And that's before we start talking about fly patterns, right? So, in the early part of the spring, you're probably still nymphing a lot of the time, but then you're going to start seeing some more activity from those blue wing olive nymphs. Then you're going to start seeing more hatches. You might even see some BWOs up on the surface. Then you're going to start seeing the caddis coming off, especially in April, kind of around that Mother's Day time frame when, late April, maybe mid-April if you're lucky, you're going to start seeing these caddis hatches pop off. That changes your game a little bit. The nymphal activity is going to change. That changes your game a little bit. And the water that you're fishing changes, right? So you go from fishing these big tailwaters with big, heavy nymph rigs where you're probably throwing, at least a 5-weight. I think I told you guys last season, I fish a 6-weight most of the time when I'm throwing heavy nymph rigs because it's just like throwing a bunch of meat around. There's weight on it. The flies are heavy. There's an indicator, and you got to move all that shit around and get it out there so you can catch a fish. Well, once you get into the spring, you could spend the early part of the day fishing a nymph rig, which means you're going to need that heavier rod. And by the afternoon, you could have fish jumping out of the water, hammering caddis or hammering mayflies, and it's time for you to put that thing away and get out a dry fly rod, a 3-weight or a 4-weight or whatever it happens to be. So you got to carry different stuff with you. You got to have new patterns, which means you got stuff to tie or buy if that's your thing. But you guys know how I feel. You really should be tying your flies if you want to have the full experience. And there is just a ton going on with the fishing equipment and the fishing tactics that you'll be using. And we really are going to dig into that this season because there is a lot to that in the spring, especially if you want to be successful. If you get out there and you hit it right, spring can be incredible, right? This is the time when you can start just racking up those fish counts, catching those pretty guys as they're waking up for their winter slumber and just having a blast. Or you could hit it wrong and have a lot of really frustrating days out there, which is obviously not what I want for you, and I'm sure not what you want for you. And then after all that, you've got the spawning patterns of these fish, right? So in the fall, we already talked a little bit about leaving the brook trout and the brown trout alone when they're spawning. Let them do their thing because it's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing to do for nature and the ecosystem and the river, and we all care about that, right, guys? I know you do. But we also do it because we want the next generation of trout for us to catch, right? Like we want to go keep catching fish, and that means you got to let the fish make fish babies because with no fish babies, there are no grown-up fish. And with no grown-up fish, then, we're all screwed and we have to go find a new hobby. And I don't want a new hobby. I'm sure you don't want one either. So, we talked a little bit about being respectful and ethical around the fall spawn. Well, now you got the spring spawn, right? So now the rainbows and the cutthroats are starting to spawn in the spring, and that's a totally different game, right? So the rivers that hold the rainbow trout, they're going to start getting feisty with each other, and then they're going to be spawning. I mean, you might be seeing reds in the river. I've seen them as early as March, but sometimes they're out there in late March. Sometimes it's April. Sometimes it's May, but that affects where and how you go fish and how you do that ethically. The cutthroats are even crazier because at those higher elevation lakes, they may not start to spawn until ice out, and ice out might not be until late May or June or even late June. And then they think it's time to spawn. So they're up there in the lakes and they are attempting to spawn. Most of the time it's not successful because they need very specific spawning habitat that often isn't provided at those high alpine lakes, but we'll talk more about that later. But they're trying to do their thing, right? And that can affect not only the fishing quality for you at those high alpine lakes, but the timing of when you even want to go up there and when you think it's worth your time to make those big, nasty, arduous hikes. So all of this stuff comes together, everything from the weather to the flows to the ice conditions to the general ground conditions. How much snow is there? Do you need spikes? Do you need snowshoes? What are the avalanche forecasts as the snow starts getting warmed up and rotten? What are the fish doing? What are the insects doing? I mean, there's a lot going on in the spring, right? It's kind of like the whole ecosystem, this whole amazing aquatic universe that we all love so much is starting to wake up from hibernation. And there is just all kinds of shit going on all over the place. And how you navigate all of that stuff, all the complexities, all the questions, everything that goes along with it is going to determine what kind of a spring season you have. And I want you to have the best, most kick-ass spring fly fishing season, and especially the best backcountry spring fly fishing season you could possibly have. So this season, we are going to spend our time talking about that, talking about how I fly fish in the spring, and working our way through as many of the things you have to be thinking about as we possibly can. Quick word about structure here before we close out. It's going to be pretty much the same as you had last season. I think we're settling into a groove here. Most episodes will probably be you hearing from me. And if you don't like me, then, well, I don't know. That sucks. I guess you'll have to find another podcast to listen to. But I've got a lot to say about this stuff. Obviously have spent a lot of time doing backcountry fly fishing in the spring. It's kind of my favorite time of year, especially because it is the end of that sort of insane winter period, which I will deal with, but can't always deal with well. That also doesn't mean that I know everything, right? I mean, there's stuff that we can learn from other experts in the field, and my hope is to get a good number of really interesting folks on here to interview about everything from getting out to even crazier backcountry destinations, to planning your hikes, to working your way through water safety and runoff and everything in between. So they'll be joining us as well periodically over the course of the season, so stay tuned for that. And we're just going to kind of work our way through all this stuff. At the end of it, we probably will take another break before we get into summer, but we might not, right? To be honest with you, my life's going to get a little less hectic. And the transition from spring into summer is so smooth, but also so important that I kind of hate to leave you hanging. So I guess we'll just sort of see how it goes here in season 3. We may wind up doing like a season 3 right into season 4 thing, but we'll see how stuff goes. In the meantime, I appreciate everybody who took the time to leave a 5-star review for the podcast. It's been really cool to read what you had to say about it. I appreciate all of you being willing to lie in public about how much you enjoy this show. And I promise I didn't pay anybody to write those reviews. But really have appreciated the feedback. The emails have been great. I've gotten a couple of Instagram messages. Obviously see the reviews that you put on Spotify and on Apple. Probably somewhere else, although I haven't been reading them anywhere else, if I'm being honest. So if you haven't done that and you're so inclined, I would love for you to do it. If you'd like to share the podcast with your friends, that would be awesome. And if you have questions or thoughts or feedback or criticisms or stories or really whatever, as long as it's not nudes, I'm not trying to get you to send me any spicy pictures, but anything else really, you can go ahead and send to me. And I would love to take a look at it. And maybe if we get enough interest and enough traction, we can have a day where we do a live stream with listener questions or just me on here answering listener questions or whatever. But it's cool to see you guys engage. It's been really cool to find this pretty niche community of folks who are into the same type of wilderness fly fishing that I am. And I'd like to dig into that because you're all pretty cool people and it would be fun to get to know you. So that's what we have planned for season 3. We will have the first real episode about the tweener season and fishing in March going up here in a week. So you've got a little bit of time to get ready for that. And then we're going to be back on that regular upload schedule, right? So we'll be putting these up every Friday at 2 p.m. Mountain, unless I miss a slot, which I will do my very best not to, but you know, every now and then life intervenes. But in any case, you will have something to look forward to every single week. And we're going to get out there and start fishing, guys. I hope you've got your waders ready. Hope you've got those rods ready to go and that you've been taking care of your gear because it's go time and it's starting to hit that warmer weather, starting to hit that proper season. And we're going to get out there and catch some fish. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thanks for tuning in. I'm really looking forward to season 3. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys more about what you need and how I can help going forward. And in the meantime, hope you're having a great week. Hope you can get out to the water because it's been incredibly, ridiculously nice, at least here in Colorado. And I hope you're catching a few of those late winter fish. Till next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there. Hope you didn't forget your dry flies.